Welcome to the Indian Gaming Association's The New Normal webcast. My name is Lisa Johnson, and I'm the conference manager for the Indian Gaming Trade Show and Convention. I'd like to share a few housekeeping tips before we get started. Everyone is muted by default except for our speakers. If you have any questions during the presentation, please type them into the question or chat box, and they'll be brought up at the end. Now, without further ado, I'd like to introduce Victor Rocha, conference chairman of the Indian Gaming Association.
Good morning, everyone, and good afternoon. And for our friends in the UK, good evening. I'm Victor Rocha. I'm your host. Welcome to the New Normal. First of all, the Indian Gaming Association's podcast, where we bring you the latest news, insights, and trends in tribal gaming. I'm your host, Victor Rocha, the Indian Gaming Association's conference chairman. My co-host, Jason Giles, is off today. He's with the chairman doing gaming stuff with the NCAI. I believe he's working on this new task force, which we'll be talking about another time. But joining me is my dear friend, Elizabeth Homer. Liz, welcome. How are you doing?
I'm great. Thank you so much for the invitation, Victor.
Thanks. Like I said, when I found out Jason couldn't make it, there was only one choice, and that was you. So you were the first and only. I didn't have to go to number two. To be honest with you, I didn't have a number two. So, but you know, today's episode, we have two special guests, our friends, Paulina and David Waugh from Regulus Partners. Gentlemen, welcome. Paul, how you doing over there?
I'm good, thank you.
Good.
Good to be here.
Dan, how are you doing?
Yeah, pretty good, thanks. Yeah,
great. So, you know, this is for us in the United States. This is a really interesting issue for some of us who are paying attention. And you know, the topic of today's show is we're going to talk about this new white paper from the UK. Can you guys give us a little information? What exactly is this white paper, and you know, how did it get here?
Shall I go, Paul? So a white paper is it's a government document which sets out proposals for changes to the legislation and to changes to policy. And it's a staging post before you get to actual legislation, because it sets out what the government wants to do. And then it invites responses from various stakeholders to whether these are good ideas or not. We've got here via a very long and tortuous road. So back in November 2019, the British government under Boris Johnson announced there would be a review of our gambling legislation. A year later, it took them a year to launch a call for evidence on this review. And it has then taken another 2.5 years to get from that call for evidence to actual publication of proposals. And that's where we are now. And that's what's in the white paper.
Yeah, it seemed like everyone was waiting for the long time. Obviously, the pandemic slowed things down. Everyone was waiting for this paper about a year ago. Maybe a little longer, but you know, it came and it dropped like a bombshell, didn't it?
I'm not sure from a UK perspective it's necessarily a bombshell. I think a lot of it was expected. You know, this has been much discussed over the last 2.5 years. We've been very close to releases of white papers in the past, so there's been a lot of the detail was trailed previously. You know, last summer it was allegedly days away from being released, and then Boris Johnson fell as prime minister, and the minister responsible resigned at the same time. And had he stayed in post, had he sort of kept his nerve, if you like, we probably have had the white paper published 9 months ago.
Paul, you gonna say something?
Yeah, thank you. I think there's one thing to add that I think is really relevant to the US perspective. And that is that the genesis of the reform came from a manifesto pledge to say that they were going to look at aspects of online gambling that had become concerning, two of which were loot boxes in esports and credit cards. I can't even remember off the top of my head what the third one was that was named as the manifesto pledge, all of which were dealt with outside of the white paper, none of which were particularly a big deal. But what we saw was massive government and regulatory mission creep. So the minute the party planted a very small flag to say we need to look at this aspect of gambling, suddenly all aspects of gambling were opened up. And I thought that's worth mentioning, given the tensions between what might be going on in Washington, D.C., various states, and also within various states. There's no such thing as a narrow look at these issues. That the minute you have something narrow being looked at, the can of worms is opened.
Yeah.
Yeah, I think
You
Paul
know,
makes a really good point there, Victor. I was just going to say, people forget, but the review was actually kicked off in Great Britain by our Department of Health, which does not have responsibility for gambling policy. That rests with the Department of Culture, Media and Sport. But for reasons that are unknown, the Department of Health decided to kick this off. And I think what we're seeing now is a bit of a tug of war between the sponsor department, which is the Department of Culture, Media and Sport, and the Department of the Health. And the Department of Health really has a sort of, I would say, a prohibitionist attitude. They want to use this review to really drive a lot of gambling into the sea. So it's quite an interesting juncture over here at the moment.
You know, when I first started going to the UK about 2011, I think it was my first show. In 2010, I think it was my first show when it was still in ICE was in the UK, and I remember, you know, going and seeing there was a sports book on every corner and almost one in the middle of the block too. And yet the sky wasn't falling down. And I remember thinking, you know, okay, look at you, they got to handle it. It's part of society. People want to gamble. It's there. If they don't, they walk by. But, you know, you guys slowly started seeing these stories in the media about the velocity and fruit machines and gambling, but they were always about somebody losing their house or someone. It was always these dramatic. So it felt like a lot of hype from, you know, the Guardian, the Sun, some of these UK papers. But then you started seeing more and more of it. And it felt like the white paper was a response, you know, that the industry was just over the top in marketing, like you couldn't get away with it. You're kind of seeing that a little bit here in the United States. You know, one of the response that you see is advertising. This seems to be the big issue that I see in the UK, the advertising with the teams, the sponsorships, the shirts. And it seems like, you know, the industry was slow to respond to these to the changes. You know what I mean? The people were kind of getting sick of it. You couldn't enjoy the game anymore. You're dealing with addiction issues. And it just seems like it was a response from the industry because the gaming industry just wasn't taking care of its own. You know, they're just so enthusiastic. Go ahead, Paul.
Yeah, I'm just going to absolutely agree with you. And again, relate this back to the US. I think oversimplifying it, but I think it's broadly true. Two things got us here in the UK. One is the growth in online gambling, and it wasn't an explosion in the UK. It took 2 decades for the UK to get where it is. And the UK per capita doesn't spend as much on online gambling as the states in the US that have online casino. They're already higher than the UK in spend per capita. But what online gambling growth does is it generates marketing and advertising, which land-based gambling doesn't to anywhere near the same extent.
Right.
The second thing that happened, which I think is super relevant in the US, is really egregious social responsibility failings. So you're right, we're talking about people losing their house, people losing £50,000 in 24 hours. The stories that the Secretary of State, the minister in charge, used to explain this are horrific stories that should never have happened. Now, the problem I think in the US is that there is still a learning curve on social responsibility. It is probably still behind the UK, and the UK operators are still making some pretty disastrous failures or allowing failures to happen. So what then happens is politicians and other stakeholders, whenever they see gambling advertising, they think about people losing their house. They don't think I want to bet, because the majority of people don't want to bet. That's one of the things about gambling. It's mass market, but it's always going to be a minority. More people don't gamble than do gamble outside of lottery. So when you have a combination of social responsibility failings and mass market advertising, you have a regulatory disaster waiting to happen. And that should make a bunch of US states uncomfortable.
Yeah, it definitely. Liz, what do you think?
Well, what I found really curious about this is some of the proposals, especially this kind of means testing proposal. How much money do you have is going to equate to how much, you know, you're going to be allowed to gamble. How does the public, you know, deal with something like that? Are people concerned about their privacy interests? Are they concerned about the amount of information having their credit you know, dinged every time they place a wager? I mean, some of this seems like it would be pretty objectionable, you know, to the average person.
I think you're absolutely right, Liz. I think the difficulty, though, is that the average person hasn't really been consulted in this. So yes, we've run a public consultation. I think the government received 16,000 responses, of which 3,000 were sort of you know, genuine responses, and another 13,000 were sort of paint by numbers responses. So the British public hasn't really taken a lot of interest, as it generally doesn't in most political decisions. So the government and the gambling regulator haven't really taken a lot of time to consult with recreational gamblers. They spend an awful lot of time talking to people who've experienced harm from gambling, but they're not really interested in the average customer. And I suppose the average customer is probably not that engaged anyway, so they're not really thinking about this. What we are seeing, and Paul might want to talk about this, but we are seeing from horse racing bettors, we are seeing quite a vocal reaction from horse racing bettors who are saying, I don't want to do this, I don't want to hand over my bank accounts in order to place a bet. And also from horse racing industry, who can see some really quite catastrophic consequences from this coming. But Paul can elaborate on that, I think.
Yeah, thanks, Dan. So absolutely, it is objectionable, but it's like all politics. The number of people who are actually affected by this is really, really small. So it's a little bit like, on one level, it's a little bit like airlines, in the, you know, flying first class might cost, I don't know, 10 times as much as flying economy or flying coach. But people in first class are typically more than 10 times wealthier than the people flying in coach. So the relative cost of flying first class is lower, bizarrely. It's the same with VIPs and casinos. It's the same with buying handbags. It's the same with a lot of luxury goods. But the arithmetic is that roughly 1% of active customers generate roughly 25–30% of revenue. Roughly 10% of customers, including that 1%, generate 70–90% of revenue. And so the vast majority of people aren't particularly affected, and so don't necessarily care all that much. But good regulation isn't about the vast majority of people alone. It's also got to be about the people who are impacted and how it impacts them. And where this is stupid as well as objectionable, bluntly, is that it targets the wealthy, obviously, right, in the assumption that the wealthy have more problems, which is dumb, frankly.
Well, that's an interesting perspective. I hadn't really thought of that, but you know, we're at a very, I think, an interesting time socially and historically in the United States. A lot of differences of opinion, you know, very polarized society. But I can see, I mean, I'm from Hominy, Oklahoma, you know, where we all believe in our personal liberties and our personal freedoms, that if I were to ask our customers at our tribal casinos to hand over their banking information and allow us to, you know, check their credit, that there would be a very strong reaction to that. And I think there would be a very strong, I don't know, Victor, what do you think? I just...
It's easy, Liz. You give them a gun. Listen, you give us your information, we'll give you a gun. That's how you do it in America. You know what I mean? You trade one personal liberty for another. It's very easy, Liz. Obviously, you haven't thought it through like I have. You know, so yeah, you know, that's something.
I was thinking of that though, Victor. It's like they're going to bring the gun. You know, they might bring the gun, and you know, if somebody's trying to, you know, invade their privacy. So
well, you know what, I think right now it's just a real shock tactic. I mean, it's just something to scare the people into getting action, although it's in the UK and it could happen. But I think even, you know, for America, something like that, I just don't think it would pass. I think there's just too much of that America individualism that just won't allow it to happen, whether you're in Maine, Texas, Florida, California. It just ain't going to happen. But you know, it's interesting, but I think it's a point of conversation. I think the big issue that we have here is to make sure it doesn't get outside the box, and that you have it, you know, actually become codified in law, because it is just very intrusive. And I don't think that was the opposite of what we want. You know, we're supposed to have a good time, right? And enjoy and be part of the process, and have a dinner and have a drink, do a little gambling, go home and have a good time, you know?
I think the scary thing over here is that there's some context to this, and that's a couple of years ago, the Gambling Commission, outside of the review, trying to preempt the review in a way, our gambling regulator, decided it wanted to impose checks at the rate of £100 a month. So if you wanted to spend £100, which is these days roughly $100 a month on gambling, you had to send in bank statements and tax returns and things like that. Now, that's not where the British government's come out. They've done something a bit more conservative with a small c. And I think in a way that frames how people respond to this, because we were looking at Armageddon, and this is a sort of slightly softer Armageddon, if you like. But what happens next is the Gambling Commission gets to implement this, and they'll put it in the license conditions and codes of practice, which is the regulation. Now that then gives them a mechanism to come back in the future and recalibrate these thresholds. And everything we see about the Gambling Commission says if they get the chance, they will probably reduce these thresholds to apply these checks to far more gamblers over time if they can. And the other thing that's worth saying is they're consulting at the moment. Again, this is outside of the white paper, which shows just how joined up things really aren't over here. But they're also consulting on requiring operators to take checks for vulnerability. And these checks would be if you're a young adult, but also if you're an older adult. It would be if you are dyslexic, if you have low levels of literacy or numeracy, and even one of the criteria they're consulting on is if you have higher than standard levels of trust or appetite for risk. So the Gambling Commission is going through this process of trying to say, look, every one of your customers is vulnerable. Therefore, you need to be applying certain checks to every single one of your customers. And that, if the Gambling Commission presses ahead with this, it's going to have some fairly profound consequences, I think.
So who are the driving forces behind the creation of this report? I mean, there's just so many scary things, I guess, from us in the industry. I mean, what is the driving force behind this thing?
Well, it's a DCMS review, and in fairness to the DCMS, I think that the Department of Culture, Media and Sport is a sort of lone voice of sanity within a lot of this debate. They put together a call for evidence in 2020, which was very sound. It covered all the right questions, and it said, look, we want to balance consumer freedoms and consumer protection. It's very balanced. But then you see intense lobbying for 2.5 years. You see government health departments get involved. You see campaigners get involved. And I think where we've ended up is that, actually the white paper, as far as we can see, it is not as bad as it might have been, but it's about what it could lead to, I think. And I think, what started out as a process of let's make good policy quickly became for the government let's get out of this with as least political damage as we can. And I think that's why we're seeing some fudges here.
Yeah. Paul?
Yeah, I think to summarize that from a US perspective, and I agree with affordability, broadly speaking. I noticed you left New York off your list, but bureaucrats with an agenda got us here. That's what got us here.
Yeah, that's what it feels like too. It feels like it's a disconnect from reality. Nice heart, nice understanding. In a perfect world, it might be, that way. But in reality, I think, what we're looking at here is personal freedoms and, the harms that gambling does, and how do we balance those, but I think it's been really fascinating from where I sit in the United States to watch it. And I think a lot of us who are paying attention can see how it can impact our industry. And, one of the other things is, a lot of the UK guys are over here in the United States now. You know what I mean? I was exchanging emails with Adam Greenblatt this morning, and Adam used to be the head of GVC. And, so you see a lot of those same people over there, Betfred, Bet365, all William Hill, obviously they're all over here now. How do you think that's going to play over here? How do you think the white paper is going to play over here?
So I think that it is probably, in the first instance, a little bit too technical for it to have a political impact. It's addressing stuff which has been, it's not UK specific, but it's framed around a UK centric debate for quite a long time. So these aren't policies that you might want to lift out of a toolkit, like the way you might deal with betting integrity or T's and C's on bonuses, or not advertising in colleges, that basic stuff. So I think that initially, I don't think that the ripple is necessarily gonna sort of hit the US particularly quickly. But I think what is a risk is that sooner or later, US subsidiaries or US companies are almost certainly going to get caught up in social responsibility failings. That's practically a given. You almost can't avoid it. The question is, how does the political and regulatory stakeholders then react to those? And I think that's when it'll be tempting for bureaucrats, especially, to say, regulators, to say, what tools can we pack in to give ourselves more power to prevent this from happening again, which to an extent we've seen a little bit in Ontario, which is a little bit of a sort of bridge between Europe and the US in terms of approach. So I think that this is not something that is going to be impacted proactively, I don't think, but I think it does potentially shape crisis response. And it might also shape the toolkit of lobbying and self-regulation, because, you know, FanDuel is likely to lead that. FanDuel is obviously got a UK parent, sort of, and that's changing, but it's still heavily integrated into Flutter. So I think that there is a logic to say stuff that's happening in the UK could have a ripple effect. But I think it goes back to the point I made earlier, that there are two basic pillars that create this tsunami effect. One is a reaction to a huge amount of advertising, and I think we're starting to get that a bit in the US. And the other is a critical mass of social responsibility failings. And I don't think that the US market has been active for long enough to throw those out in an online environment. I mean, bear in mind that online gambling has been occurring organically in Britain since it started, since the mid-90s. It was regulated officially by the Gambling Commission sort of in 2007, but they didn't have a remit because everything stayed offshore. In 2014, the Gambling Commission got the remit, but it really took until 2017, 2018 before lots and lots of news flow about social responsibility failing started to come through and the big fines started to happen. So it takes a little while, and COVID has been a great sort of gap in active regulation. So I think that the US is now entering the danger zone in terms of increased scrutiny of online gambling.
Well, you know, today and yesterday in the United States, they announced an investigation into Iowa State, and they're talking about the University of Alabama. Am I correct? Let me make sure I get those names right. Yeah. Iowa State, University of Alabama. So yes, so you know, you saw the industry come out in the United States, some rules about colleges, but initially, you know, they were just going crazy, signing these deals with the colleges, PointsBet and the University of Colorado, Caesars. Now they've all rescinded these deals. They've, you know, and it's just like they're ignoring what happened in the UK at their own risk. You know what I mean? And so now you're seeing, I think the college scandals can be big enough to bite the industry in the butt. And I think they're being proactive, but, you know, one day you have Alabama, the next day you have Iowa. You know, this is not a good sign whatsoever for the industry. So, you know, I think the industry, you know, and the other thing I'll say about the UK, I think the industry shot itself in the foot. And I'll say this, and the reason why is they knew this thing was coming. And I know there was a gambling fund they were supposed to voluntarily put money in, and every year it was short. And every year there was an article, it was like the industry is not doing what they're supposed to. And there was this big egg in their face every year, and yet it happened again and again. You know what I mean? So they really shot themselves in the foot. And, you know, and now they're over here in the United States, and, you know, and it feels like the same sloppy mess. And I think the professionals are trying to get in front of it, but I think the industry loses their mind when they think about gaming, they think about money, responsible gaming. I think they're doing a better job in the United States in putting it forward, but I still think they have a long ways to go. I think the things like Iowa and Alabama are going to come and bite them, and I think it's going to restrict. Yesterday, the AGA talked about a poll, an online poll they did, that 85% of Americans support an end of federal sports betting ban. I'm not buying that. I need to look at the numbers. Send the report over here. I'll look at it. So you're seeing it here in the United States, but I think they seem to be a little more ahead of it than they are in the UK. Again, I feel that the UK shot up themselves in the foot, and they could have made this thing less, but they chose not to, or they ignored it, and they had those public, face plants,
Yeah, I think the industry shot itself in the foot and pretty much all other body parts during the. And actually going back,
one bullet, every part, every vital organ hit.
Going back to the affordability checks, I mean, people forget who came up with that idea in the first place. The industry. So it was the affordability checks was the industry's idea. They said, look, we don't need stake limits online. We don't need all these other things, because guess what? We can look at data and we can tell when a customer's gambling beyond their means. And what the campaigners did then, they said, oh, that's really interesting. Oh, we're not sure you should be doing that. We maybe you're conflicted here. Maybe we should be doing it instead. And so that's where affordability checks come from. So you're absolutely right. And those who refuse to learn from history are doomed to repeat it. So that is the big question: is whether the US can learn from all the mistakes over here.
Yeah. Well, go ahead, Liz.
I was just going to say that, we really are still in the very early stages of, even deploying sports wagering, much less internet gaming, legally in all of our 50 states. And here our gaming is very decentralized. Each state has its own set of rules and regulations, its laws. All of the tribes, they have their own set of regulations and laws. And so it's a very different kind of place in history where we are right now. And I think it is useful for all of us to take a look at, not only what has been the experience in the UK in this regard, but maybe take some prophylactic measures so that we're not, facing some really dreadful public policy, coming down the road at us like a truck out of control on a 45-degree slope.
Yeah, I agree. And I think the critical, again, another key lesson I think from the UK is that the prophylactic measures that were deployed over here for a long time were based upon what looked good or what sounded good, not whether it was effective. And I think one of the biggest, gravest mistakes the industry made was really handing responsibility of this to the PR departments and the lobbyists. And what they were concerned of was placating politicians or press. But placating politicians and press doesn't actually solve the customer issue. And if you don't solve the customer issue, you don't solve the issue. And, I think if there's a bit of advice for the US market, it's got to be really understand these issues, understand them in quite some depth. Don't treat this as a PR issue, treat this as a customer issue. And actually at heart, all the things that we've gone wrong, all the things we've got wrong in this country, all the things Paul's been talking about, at heart, these are failings of customer service. And I think maybe that gives me a little bit of cause for optimism in the US, because I think, the US operators, particularly the Vegas operators and casino operators, Pachanga and elsewhere, they get customer service, in a way that Britain, we're still sort of stuck in the 1940s as far as customer services go. So I think a customer service orientated approach to this has more opportunity of working in the US, really putting the customer at the heart rather than letting the PR guys determine what policies should be put in place. Because ultimately, at the severe end, you're talking about trying to stop psychiatric disorder here. Why on earth would you ask a lobbyist to address a psychiatric disorder question? It's ludicrous.
Yeah, one of the things, and I didn't say this earlier, one of the things, there was 6 main categories outlined in the white paper. There was online protections for player and products, marketing and advertising, the Gambling Commission's powers and resources, dispute resolution and consumer redress, children and young adults, and land-based gaming. So, there's a lot here, but the one about the Gambling Commission's powers and resources, tell us a little more about this and what is their role in the UK? And is this something that could be transferable in the United States? So
I think the legislation, the primary legislation in this country was mainly enshrined in 2005. And at that point, online is still relatively small. It's been around for about a decade, but it's still relatively small. And so the legislation is really focused on a land-based industry. And so a lot of the detailed legislation is there about casinos, bingo clubs, betting shops, and arcades. There is some there for online, but it's not detailed. So the Gambling Commission gets to do anything that is not specifically reserved in the legislation for the government. So if there's an absence of detail in the legislation about online gambling, it gives the Gambling Commission quite expansive powers to introduce regulation. So you get a sort of slightly bifurcated thing where actually a lot of the land-based gambling rules sit within legislation, but a lot of the online rules sit within regulation. And the difference there is that the Gambling Commission can change these things much more quickly and with very little scrutiny. So it runs consultations, but it doesn't have to explain why it's come up with ideas. There's no parliamentarians discussing its proposals. So you get it has a lot of powers to do things by regulatory fiat. So there is some advantages to that in terms of flexibility and not having to wait for Congress to make decisions. But I think if you create a regulator that can change the rules of the market at whim, that can be quite concerning.
Yes.
Let me come in on that though, because I think there's a flip side to that argument to get a balance. And I think that is that in a well-functioning gambling market, the gambling regulator is the gambling business's best friend, because everybody is aligned to making this work. That when it goes wrong is when the gambling regulator looks like they're getting it wrong or is actually getting it wrong. And what we've seen in the UK is the gambling regulator trying to play catch up on an out of control industry, make a bunch of stupid mistakes by trying to get ahead of the politics, and then the politics still comes in anyway. So I think that the broad message for the US is make sure that the regulator is an expert in social responsibility, advertising rules, and all of this sort of thing, so that it can be done, that the issues can be dealt with by grown-ups who understand what's going on in state around a small table of engaged individuals. Because the minute that trust breaks down, it gets politicized. And that's when the disaster starts. So I think the big danger for the US is if a critical mass of operators think, hey, regulator hasn't got a clue about online, we can do what we like. And the minute that gap starts to grow in practice and knowledge, you're going to get a horrible backlash, either from the regulator or from the politicians, or in the UK's case, both.
Yeah, I think that's a really excellent point. And I do think that, you know, at least I work mostly in tribal gaming, and I work mostly on the regulatory side. You know, I'm a former member of the National Indian Gaming Commission. And, you know, this has been a big concern of mine, you know, for a number of years. I think I've been talking about this, you know, ever since, you know, 2014, 2015, when you started to see, you know, the increased discussion about internet gaming and about sports wagering, and it, you know, federal legislation was being introduced, and, you know, there was a lot going on. Of course, the COVID kind of slowed everything down, but that gap in knowledge about the technology between the regulators and the operators, that's a very serious problem. You know, I mean, that is something that we all have a vested interest in correcting and making sure that we all know what we're doing, you know, when we start going into these areas. I think public policy in the United States has been slowed, you know, by the fear of technology. We're afraid of the technology, and it's like, you know, we get to a certain age and it's like, you know, our members of Congress, you know, their average age is, what is it, Victor, now? Like they're 70.
Decaying. No, they're like decaying. They're beyond, they're in the decaying phase right now.
They're just terrified, you know, they're just terrified of making these decisions. They don't understand the technology. And, you know, to a lesser extent, I feel that same way. You know, it's like, I wish I were more adept at the technology, you know, coming from the perspective of my clients who are primarily gaming regulators. Yeah.
And I think it's it's important to recognize this conflict within any business. Anybody who is in charge of a day-to-day P&L, it suits them by and large that the regulator doesn't really understand what they're doing. That's just a fact. It is what it is. So it's incumbent on on senior management to instill sustainability and be aware of what's going on at the operations management layer, because all of the terrible failings that have occurred in the UK have occurred at the operations management layer. There's no way that boards and chief execs and even some heads of department would have any idea what's going on. It's happening because it's kind of beneath their pay grade, and that totally misses the point.
Yeah, you know, one of the other things that I'm seeing here is also, you know, to get some of these regulations, I think they're really starting to demonize gambling. You know what I mean? So as we talked earlier, it's the new tobacco. You know what I mean? This is gambling. There's no good aspect of it. And, you know, in the United States, and especially, you know, for Liz and I, you know, as Native Americans, you know, gaming has been a game changer for us in the last 30 years. So we don't necessarily see it like that, but you're seeing in the UK, this real demonization of the industry. Can you talk about that? What is your take on this?
Yeah, so I think a lot of this comes from the public health lobby, and there's a syndrome that the philosopher Kenneth Minogue came up with called St. Georgian retirement syndrome, which is, you know, public health is really good work. You know, they sorted out the sanitation, but then when you get the sanitation sorted out, well, what are you going to do? So public health is constantly looking for new dragons to slay. And it's looking now in this country at gambling. It's also looking at alcohol. It's looking at pizza. It's looking at coffee.
Pizza.
Pizza, yeah. So
video games, obviously video games.
Yeah,
and
video
stuff
games.
like that, right?
It's, you know, it's there's pretty soon, you know, we're sort of heading towards if this carries on, we are heading to this dystopian state where we just exist on mung beans and yoga. But so I think there's a big push on the public health lobby, which is self-interested in finding new things to do. And that has applied itself to that. And so that's where, you know, we have our Department of Health and Social Care has said, and we obtain these documents by Freedom of Information Act, they said we want to take the same approach to gambling as we have to tobacco, without any evidence that these things are comparable, and also without any sort of consideration for the fact that, yes, people do experience harms from gambling, but people also get a lot of fun from it. They get a lot of benefits from it. We actually know from our health survey data over here that if you gamble, you are less likely to experience depression than if you don't gamble. People who gamble are generally happier people. Now, we can't say that's causal. We can't say that that's because of their gambling, but, you know, then it's plausible that if lots of people are doing stuff, they're doing it for a reason. They're doing it because it gives them fun and some sort of utility in their life. So, but yeah, there's a big public health movement which has got real tentacles into the government here, which sees gambling as something that only involves harms and has no beneficial consequences whatsoever, and they want to control it.
Yeah, that's not a good look, but it doesn't, you know, it feels it's strident in its approach. It's strident in its approach. It just feels like a lot of hyperbole, and I think it just really damages them by using that type of language, because, you know, there are some good things in that white paper. I think, you know, there are some solid practices in there. I just, once you peel away some of this nonsense, you know, like some of this nanny state legislation or ideas, and I think, you know, maybe we have something there.
Yeah, I was just going to say, I think everyone's focusing on the short-term stuff like stake limits and affordability checks. I think the bigger consequence of this white paper are potentially the things that nobody's talking about. So the creation of this levy fund, which you talked about, but, you know, it's creation of a levy fund, which is probably going to fund a lot of anti-gambling research. We're going to have a public messaging campaign, a public health messaging campaign, which may go down the lines of, you know, some people want it to go down the lines of gambling kills, you know, very tobacco orientated.
Oh gosh.
So our Department of Health proposed last year that taxes on gambling should go up every year above the rate of inflation, so ultimately to extinction. And they also proposed, this is the last one I'll leave you, they proposed that there should be plain packaging for all gambling products, so that no gambling product should have any colors, logos, or images. So if you think about a deck of cards that you're playing blackjack within a casino, they're black and white, there's no kings, queens, or jacks on them, and there's no,
wow.
I mean, it's quite insane, some of this stuff, and you look at it and you go, well, that's nonsense.
Well, you know, Dan, from the people who are colorblind impaired, it's actually a good thing. So you're not thinking about them, you know, Dan, you're very limited, you know, take off the blinders, my friend, and think about those other people who are suffering.
I can see the light now.
Liz, from a Native American perspective, I think there are some things that we can take. I feel, and maybe I might be a little biased, but I sometimes feel the Native Americans are maybe a little ahead in problem gambling and customers and customer service and stuff like that. But I know that's where my bias lies and stuff like this. What is there something that we can take from here, or is this just something we could just stand back and watch?
Well, I do think that, coming from different perspectives, there's a lot that can be taken from here. I mean, one, there's a cloud far, far on the horizon across the ocean, and is it going to float over here and start affecting what's going on here politically? Because as we all know, as a matter of public policy, gambling is cyclical, and it's been cyclical for thousands and thousands of years. I did some research in the history of gaming. It was really shocking to me. The Great Wall of China was built with gambling proceeds, right? And stuff like that. I mean, Harvard and Yale and
Come on,
the big East Coast Ivy League schools were built with gambling revenue. Half of Washington was built with gambling revenue. And
lotteries
then,
right.
bam, there'd be a scandal. And then the public policy would, start to change. I think we in any country, in particular here in the United States, have a vested interest in, one, making sure that our gaming is unimpeachable, right? And to that end, we do use technology that, returns funds to players at a certain level. There's a return system that, the players can, will get a little bit of their money kicked back to them using this technology. As gaming regulators, if a person turns himself in as wanting to, be excluded from our premises, we honor that and we help them stick to that, and pretty strictly regulate our problem gamers programs and make sure they can't just change their mind next week. There's, a long time before they can come back if they've self-excluded. We also do some excluding ourselves, but usually not because a person has problem gaming, but I guess that's something that could be looked at. So there's things like that, and that maybe we should be starting to think about more now, so that if there is a political kind of pushback against gaming, we have some answers. We have some tools that we're using that people will know, because for us, gaming is 100% tax. In Indian country, gaming is 100% tax revenue going back to our tribal governments. They, pay for our sewer systems and our, police and our law enforcement and all of our government services. And, so we have a very, very vested interest in making sure we have a clean, unimpeachable industry. And maybe stuff like this will help us, see how we can shore that up even more.
Yeah, I think the lessons here are, as the industry moves from terrestrial gambling, a lot of these big issues, obviously in the UK, and you've seen, at first it was like the fruit machines, there was too much velocity, there's too much playing, if people are losing their houses, so they limited that, and now they seem to be going, sports betting seems to be the catalyst. And I feel this is because everybody has such an emotional interest in these teams, and it makes gambling emotional. And I think that's what they're trying to go after is, I know you love, I mean, listen, when last time I was in London, I got out of I was over in Suffolk, and they have a soccer team over there, local team. So you go out and everybody has the scarves and the chants, and everyone's, at first you're like, oh, what's going on? Then you realize it's just a bunch of guys in dockers and scarves screaming their favorite teams and stuff like that. So, it's really, you see that investment in the community. So for their local team. So I think that seems to be the big issue that I've always seen, is that it's sports betting, the way, it feels, and the industry feels, or the other people, that it's a direct line to your children. You know what I mean? And that's how it feels. They look at sports, the children, next thing you know, they're watching the game, you're going to get your kids into gambling. And this kind of brings to my question is, how does the white paper, what are the reports for to protect children and other gambling related harms? What were the recommendations?
Well, they were fairly limited, but then again, gambling by children in this country is very low. Well, sorry, I'll phrase it. Around 1 in 3 children will gamble on something, but that is mainly things that are legal. So it's playing cards with their friends and family. It's having private bets with their friends. Or we have these seaside arcades where they have 2p machines that you can push their amusements. So that's what children do. A very, very small percentage, it's actually 5%, engage in underage gambling. And of those that are doing it online, it's about 1.5%. And where they're doing it because their parents are letting them do it. So we don't really, I would say, we don't really have a problem with underage gambling in this country. And in fact, the rate of gambling participation by children has fallen dramatically at the same time as more clubs are signing up sponsors. So I think this claim that the sponsorship of football clubs and enterprises by gambling firms has fueled a sort of, in the terms of the Guardian, an epidemic of children gambling or problem gambling is simply not true. But nevertheless, I think what you're seeing more is a visceral reaction to this, that people just feel it's a bit too much, and that may be inevitable because it's betting and it's sports, and maybe that makes us feel a bit uncomfortable. But it may also be that the operators, the marketing departments have been really quite crass in the way they promoted these things. So I think if they'd gone at these things in a bit more, with greater sort of, a bit more grown up about this, a bit less in your face, a bit more subtle, maybe things didn't have to come to this point.
Yeah. So, and I think one of the big differences too is here in the United States is that you're seeing the media companies are into sports betting here. The BBC doesn't have sports betting, but yet you're seeing ESPN, some of these other, and you're seeing more stories of it's just, you can't escape it anymore. If you're not gambling, the narrative is if you're not gambling, then you're not enjoying the game, and
That's a dangerous narrative.
Yes.
It is. And that you're seeing it more and more in the United States because of part of the sports broadcasting, the odds, and it's just creeping into the game and it's changing the face of the game. You're starting to see the voices are starting to pop up in the wilderness, and people, so I think that's also one of the big differences in the United States and the UK is that the media companies,
I think Britain can actually claim credit or responsibility for that, depending on how you take it, because I think one of the things that people looked at in the UK market was the extraordinary success of Sky Bet.
Right.
Sky being news, and what people don't or couldn't see right at the beginning, but now we've got 1 out of 4, which isn't good odds. So Sky Bet was really successful, and that was a brand partnership principally, but it was owned by Sky. It was reported into Sky until it was bought by private equity not all that long ago. We've had Fox Bet, which has been a bit of a disaster. Exactly the same playbook from the same guys. There was an attempt also, or there is an attempt in Australia that looks like it's going a bit sour from the media reports coming out of there. So I think a lot of the media companies have wanted to emulate Sky by having their own betting brand, and haven't noticed how many, and some bets, failed in the UK. I can't remember whether I just mentioned that or not, and haven't noticed that, there's one big successful media brand in betting, which is mostly because it's a really good betting company that happens to have a media brand attached to it, and then there's a load of wrecks on the side of the road where they've failed. So
that's brilliant point. I totally forgot about Sky Bet too, and it's changing how the game's played, and you're starting to see more editorials on Sunday talking about it too. And I, like I said, I'm seeing those voices more and more in my daily work and stuff like that. So so where do you think this is going? We're in the first. It just got released last week. We're all still processing it. How did it land in the UK, and what do you think are the possibilities of it moving forward, and what will be adopted? I know there's a lot there, so I apologize.
Well, I'll go first. I think, as I said at the top, it was largely as expected. So it wasn't a real bombshell over here. Most of the proposals were fairly well flagged. The trick is that lots of these things now have to be consulted on separately. So with a lot of these proposals, we still don't know the details. So the online slot stake limit could be £2, but it could be £15. The affordability checks, the nature of those have yet to be absolutely buttoned down. The amount of money that operators are going to pay into this new levy is yet to be decided. So there's a lot of things where, we're still really in the realms, we're not, it's principles with a little bit of detail, but not absolutely buttoned down what's going to happen. So yeah, that's where we are. It will move forward now, not as a single process. So the government has to do some things. The government is going to consult on some matters like increasing the number of gaming machines in casinos, for example, which is one of the rare sort of expansionist measures in the white paper. Whereas the Gambling Commission will move forward most of the online stuff. The Gambling Commission will probably look to move forward quickly because they don't have to consult Parliament on these things. But, there's going to be an awful lot of consultations in the next year. And it will take the Gambling Commission time to work through those consultations. And then if people don't like what they come out with, which is inevitable, because the Gambling Commission's caught between an industry that doesn't want to be damaged too much and campaigners that want, really want to suppress it, we may see legal challenges and all sorts of things. So I think the government will look to get out of this as quickly as possible, but we could be in for a long period of re-regulation through the Gambling Commission in this country.
It doesn't seem like the media is your friends at all either. I mean, they're just like, was it a week ago talking about, they're buying off, ministers and all this, so all the drama in the Guardian and the Sun. And so they're just having a good time with this thing. But, that's bad for the industry because, they're just stoking the flames without any real care about what's coming out at the end. They just try to sell papers and, and I think what the end game is what we want. Obviously, we want the protections in place, but we want an industry that is allowed to grow and to grow healthily and unrestricted, from these nanny laws and this nanny state type of behavior and stuff like that. And the industry is at a point where they can do this. It's just, like you said, you're going to have these hearings. It's going to be a lot of drama. It's going to be in the paper. It's definitely starting to bleed over here in the United States. You're seeing it in the media. Just a little bit of interest. It's not the same type as in the UK, but the ones who write about gaming are all paying attention.
You mentioned earlier, actually, Liz mentioned that the cloud that sits on the other side of the Atlantic, but a little cloud actually crossed the Atlantic. I think it was last week. There was a conference in Washington, DC, called Stop Predatory Gambling. And I think half of the panel, so Natasha Schull was on there and various others, but half of the panel were Brits. There were campaigners from Britain who are now targeting the US and saying, look what we've achieved in Britain, we should be doing the same over here. So, the idea that, it may not cross, and obviously USA has, perhaps stronger beliefs in personal freedom than we do, although we did come up with the Magna Carta. So but what you should know is that there are people
who write that down.
We've achieved something in Britain and we want to make it happen elsewhere too. So there are people with that are putting a big target on the US.
Well, it's a really fascinating, I don't see any questions from our guests, but, this has been a fascinating conversation. Liz, before we wrap this up, what's your take on this? I asked Liz to host with me and this was new to her. So she had to do her cramming before the session,
I'm really appreciative, Victor, that you awakened me to this because, as he said, I'm pretty insular. I'm pretty much focusing on what's happening, here with my clients. But it is a good wake up call. I'm really interested or, concerned about things that could be like a national approach, the advertising restrictions, a lot of those kinds of things that, could be harmful to any gaming. I think that this, I guess using Victor's language, this kind of nanny state kind of approach to this is is very alarming because we've seen it happen successfully here before. I mean, we went through prohibition, right? We've seen public policy go to far extremes. And for any country, that would be a very terrible thing, that would be just financially, economically devastating to our communities. So being alert to it, watching out, taking prophylactic measures, all of those things are to our advantage. And I really appreciate the chance to meet you, gentlemen, and learn more about this. And thank you, Victor, for inviting me. I really enjoyed this conversation.
Well, thanks, Liz. It was I think it's a gift to be able to have these conversations with Dan and Paul. We really appreciate you guys educating us. We'll be back in London in February, I believe. And, we are watching it and we're seeing how it's going to impact the industry. And like I said, I think, the industries have gotten so much closer in the last 10 years. And, we share the same information. We share the industry and jobs and stuff like that. And whenever you go to the UK to these gambling conferences, it's just like going to one of our shows because there's so many people so familiar. So it just shows you how much of our industry is related to each other. The UK and it's seamless. So I think the big issue here is I think if you have more of these college gambling scandals, that's going to be what's going to be going to give it the inertia. You have a couple more of these stuff. I think the one for the Alabama was ridiculous with the coach gambling. The great that they got him with the software, that was really phenomenal that they were able to peg that suspicious bet. But I think if you get more of these stuff like that, I think you'll get a response from the Puritan American, which also exists with this American individualism. That aspect of it also exists too. That's the dichotomy of an American, right? So that's my big concern. I think if you have more of these college scandals, I think that's where America draws the line, for the kids and the colleges and stuff like that. So, but you see an industry that is just determined, we need college. That's where the money is. And, when you don't have it and the people are saying, listen, let's do a slower approach. Let's do gaming. Let's leave college out. And the industry starts screaming, we need college. We need college. We need college. It's going to bite them in the ass, so. Gentlemen, thank you very much. We will be back next week. I'd like to thank my guests, Dan Waugh and Paul Leyland from Regulus. I get your newsletters occasionally from my partner, Gene, and they're always brilliant and illuminating and some of the best reads in the industry. So if you guys don't know Regulus Partners, now you do. I highly recommend reaching out to them. They're brilliant guys. And thank you so much, guys, for educating us on this fascinating issue of the UK white paper. So Liz, thank you for co-hosting, and everyone, we'll see you next week. Thanks a lot, guys. Bye.
Thank you very much.